There is a truth the powerful have spent centuries making sure you never find. It isn't in any bestseller. No university teaches it. And the people who do stumble onto it, really onto it, not just intellectually but in their bones, never see other people quite the same way again. This truth was written by a man who had lost everything, not theorized from a comfortable distance, written from the dirt, from disgrace, from the particular silence of someone the world has decided to forget. What he left behind remains, 500 years later, the most ruthlessly honest account of how human beings actually operate. Not the version we perform for each other, the version that shows up under pressure when something is genuinely at stake, when loyalty starts to cost something real. If you absorb what follows, something will shift, not dramatically, not with any ceremony, the way things shift when they go deep rather than wide. The letter no one was waiting for. December 1513. A 44-year-old man is living on a small farm in Tuscany, 10 kilometers from the city, that had defined his entire existence. 14 months earlier, he was one of the most consequential men in Florence, negotiating with kings, managing armies, sitting across from people who could have him killed, and showing no sign of fear. Then, everything came apart. The Medici came back to power. He was accused of conspiracy. They arrested him, bound his hands behind his back, and hung him from the ceiling until his shoulders were on the edge of dislocation. 6 times. He confessed nothing, because there was nothing to confess. They eventually let him go, but not before taking everything: his title, his role, his city. He was sent to the countryside to be quietly forgotten. This is the point where most people fall apart, where the drinking starts, or the bitterness, or the slow collapse into someone smaller than they used to be. He did none of that. He wrote a letter to his friend, Francesco Vettori. Not to complain, not to ask for help, just to describe the texture of his days, haggling with farmhands over wages, playing cards at the village tavern, laughing with people who had no idea who he used to be. He was living an utterly ordinary life because that was what remained to him. But in the evenings, something changed. He described it himself, and the words have held up remarkably well. When evening comes, I return home and go into my study. At the door, I take off my muddy day clothes and put on proper dress, as though I were going to meet a prince. And I enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where I am welcomed warmly and fed on the only food that is truly mine. A man the world had thrown away kept refusing to become small. He dressed for the occasion of reading. He treated a few hours alone with dead thinkers as the most significant part of his day. And in that room, without money or title or prospects, he wrote The Prince, a book that has been unsettling people ever since. The first and most uncomfortable truth. Machiavelli's biography isn't context. It's the opening argument. He didn't write about hardship from safety. He wrote the clearest thing he ever wrote while life was actively trying to undo him. And the idea at the center of everything, the one that generates everything else, it is this: the world does not reward goodness. It rewards the ability to see accurately. Not intelligence in the abstract, not drive or charisma. The specific, difficult ability to look at people and situations and yourself without flinching from what's actually there, without softening it into what you'd prefer to see. Most people never manage this, not because they lack the capacity, but because seeing clearly is genuinely uncomfortable, and the alternative, a version of the world where effort pays off reliably and loyalty runs both ways and things are basically fair, is so much more livable. Machiavelli didn't despise people who chose that version. He just noticed what the world tends to do with them. It uses them as material for someone else's ambitions. He wrote something that still makes people flinch, that at bottom, human beings act in their own interest and behave otherwise only when it costs them more not to. The usual response is to call this cynical, but Machiavelli wasn't expressing a feeling. He was describing a force, the way you'd describe gravity, not with judgment, just with precision. Gravity isn't cruel, it just operates. Understand it, and you can build almost anything. Pretend it doesn't apply to you and it will find you anyway, usually at the worst possible moment. That friend you're certain would never let you down. That person whose affection you've never questioned. Machiavelli would say, gently but without sentiment, you haven't yet seen them in a situation where loyalty actually costs them something. Character isn't revealed in easy conditions. It shows up when the stakes get real. Accepting this isn't a step toward bitterness, it's a step toward solid ground. Because once you stop expecting human nature to behave differently than it does, you stop being blindsided by it. You stop spending yourself on betrayals that were, in hindsight, entirely predictable. You stop building on sand. Florence, 1494. Machiavelli didn't arrive at these ideas through abstract reasoning. He watched them unfold in real time when he was 25 years old. The Medici had run Florence for nearly 60 years. They had bought loyalty through patronage, through money, through the accumulated weight of decades. Their power looked permanent, the way power always looks permanent, right up until it isn't. Then the French king crossed the Alps with a real army, and the whole structure collapsed overnight. Piero de' Medici surrendered the city's fortresses without a fight to save his own life. The people who had celebrated the family for generations looted their palace within hours. No one remembered the art they'd commissioned. No one remembered anything. The machinery of self-interest switched on and swept the rest away. Machiavelli watched all of it and said nothing, publicly, for years. But he remembered every detail, and what he understood, watching that collapse, was something worth sitting with. Every person in your life is loyal up to exactly the point where loyalty becomes costly. When conditions shift, the gap between what was real and what was performance becomes impossible to miss. This doesn't mean trusting no one. It means understanding what trust actually is, not a feeling, but a structure. Something that needs tending, that has load-bearing limits, that will fail if you ask more of it than it was built to hold. Two forces, one life. Here is where Machiavelli breaks from almost every other thinker who has tried to tell you something useful about how to live. He never claimed you could become whatever you wanted badly enough. He never spoke of unlimited potential. What he talked about was a tension, one that runs through every life, quietly, whether you're aware of it or not. Two forces pulling in opposite directions. Your fate, he thought, depended less on circumstance than on which one you were actively feeding. The first, he called virtù. It has nothing to do with virtue in the moral sense. It's closer to capability, the willingness to act, the skill to act well, the nerve to make decisions in conditions where the outcome isn't guaranteed. It's what converts circumstances into opportunities. It's what keeps a man functional when everything around him is falling apart. The second he called fortuna, and he didn't mean luck in the casual sense. He meant everything that operates beyond your reach. The family you were born into, the economy that collapsed before you got started, the illness, the timing, the people who had power over your life before you had any say in the matter. He compared it to a river in flood, capable of destroying everything, predictable in its general behavior, but not in its specific devastation. What should genuinely unsettle you is what he said next. Roughly half of your life falls under Fortuna's dominion. Half. No amount of effort or intelligence or planning changes that proportion. It simply isn't available for your control. But the other half is, and that half, he believed, is where everything actually gets decided. The problem, and Machiavelli saw this clearly, is how casually people waste that half. On arguments that produced nothing, on relationships that ran out of future years ago but haven't been honestly addressed, on work chosen for appearances rather than inclination, on habits that kill time without building anything. And then, when the difficult moment arrives, when the storm that was always going to come finally does, there's nothing in reserve. No preparation, no resilience, no interior resources, just the faint hope that this time life will go easy on them. It won't. That's not how the river works. The mask. Machiavelli made an observation that gets misread more than almost anything else he wrote. People see what you show them. The world forms its judgments based on what's visible, your bearing, your consistency, the story that exists about you when you're not in the room. And that visible layer often matters more than whatever is happening beneath it. This isn't a license to deceive, it's an observation about how perception operates. And it's more or less accurate. Most people don't have the time or the interest to look past the surface. They work with the information you give them, which means the information you give them is consequential. He studied Agathocles of Syracuse, a man of genuinely low birth who clawed his way to governing one of the great cities of the ancient world through a combination of ability and ruthless, calculated violence. Machiavelli looked at this story without sentiment and said, yes, he won. He held power for years, but he never held it in peace. He was surrounded by guards because he had built on a foundation that couldn't be trusted. Every position had to be defended constantly. The mask became the only thing, and somewhere in the process, he lost track of what, if anything, lay behind it. The lesson isn't about the ends and the means, it's about structural integrity. You can get somewhere through dishonesty, but then the rest of your life goes into maintaining the fiction, and that particular form of exhaustion doesn't really resolve, it just compounds. The real advice is harder. Become someone who doesn't need the performance, solid enough that what you project is simply a reflection of something genuine. And stop putting energy into convincing people of your worth. That's always the wrong game. The right game is showing up with enough consistency that the question eventually stops being asked. When there's no gap between what you are and what you show, there's nothing to undermine. The cycle. In the discourses, Machiavelli mapped something that plays out over and over across history and shows no sign of stopping. Societies, institutions, individuals all tend to follow the same arc. Born from necessity, shaped by struggle, strengthened by constraint, and then gradually softened by the very success those earlier conditions produced. Rome didn't fall to outside force. It fell because the internal conditions that had made Romans formidable stopped being maintained. Comfort inherited, rather than earned, doesn't tend to produce the same qualities as comfort fought for. The generation that built something and the generation that receives it are rarely interchangeable. You don't need to look at empires to see this. It happens in individual lives on a smaller scale, usually without anyone noticing it's happening. You work hard, you establish something, you arrive at a certain stability, and that stability slowly starts doing what stability does. It removes the pressure that was forcing you to grow. Learning starts to feel optional. Effort starts to feel excessive. You level off, and then life, which hasn't leveled off, eventually presents you with a test for which you are no longer as prepared as you once were. Machiavelli's prescription sounds almost perverse, given how much of modern life is organized around avoiding discomfort. The friction is the point. The difficulty you're steering around might be the exact thing that would have sharpened you. The conversation you keep not having could be the one that saves something worth saving. Comfort isn't a reward, it's an anesthetic, and it works very well right up until you need to feel something. What gets built in the dark? The word that reappears most insistently in Machiavelli's writing, as in various forms across different contexts, is necessity. The condition of having no alternative, the pressure that strips away all the optional things and leaves only what you're actually made of. He believed you don't learn much about yourself when everything is running smoothly. Ease is a poor teacher. The harder conditions, the ones you wouldn't have chosen, those are where something real gets formed. It's not a comfortable idea, but his observation was that the most capable people almost always come out of circumstances that required something of them that easier circumstances would never have demanded. He also understood, from direct experience, the peculiar advantage of being underestimated. When people don't take you seriously, they stop watching carefully. And when people stop watching carefully, you gain something. Time. Time to prepare without scrutiny. Time to build without being interrupted. Time to become something that, when it finally becomes visible, seems to have appeared from nowhere. He spent 14 years doing exactly that, exiled, dismissed, written off. And those 14 years produced the work that outlasted everyone who had dismissed him. Most people work in proportion to how observed they feel. Take away the audience and the effort drops. Machiavelli was different. He worked because not working wasn't something he was capable of. Because the work was the point, not the recognition that might follow it. That distinction separates people who leave something behind from people who simply pass through. The half that's yours. You were born into a world that doesn't owe you anything, not maliciously, just as a structural fact. People will be good to you when it serves them and indifferent when it doesn't, and that isn't a failure of love so much as a feature of human nature. Making your peace with that, without curdling into resentment, is one of the more useful things you can do. Your body is wearing down, your mind is more capable of self-deception than you probably realize. Time is shorter than it feels on an ordinary Tuesday, and a substantial portion of what happens to you will be determined by forces you can neither predict nor control, but the other portion won't. And that's the one that actually matters, the one that determines not just what happens to you, but who you become in response to it. So, prepare rather than hope. Build things that hold under pressure, not just under favorable conditions. Judge people by the pattern of their behavior over time, not by what they say about themselves or what you'd like to be true. Develop capabilities that can't be taken from you. Cultivate the relationships that have actually been tested, not just the ones that feel close because they've never been strained. And when you arrive somewhere that feels like success, treat that feeling as a signal to pay closer attention, not to relax. Move. Do something. Machiavelli's contempt for paralysis was sharper than his contempt for error. A wrong decision at least teaches you something about the territory. Waiting for certainty teaches you nothing and costs you time you can't get back. What made him last? There's one idea near the end of his writing that most people read past without it landing. The man who builds in the dark is more dangerous than the man who shouts in the light, because the one who shouts needs an audience, and the one who builds only needs time. Machiavelli's last years were quiet in the worst sense. No recognition, no reward, no vindication while he was alive to receive it. He kept writing, anyway, kept thinking, kept doing the only thing he believed was genuinely worth doing. That's what made him last. Not the influence he once had, the refusal, consistent, undramatic, unglamorous, to let his circumstances determine what he was. The ability to look at his situation honestly, at his worst moment, and continue anyway. Not out of hope exactly, out of something more stubborn than hope. A lot of people reading this are in a version of that moment right now, where the effort isn't producing what it should, where something broke and left a gap that's hard to name, where time feels like it's running out and the quieter part of your mind has started suggesting that maybe it was always going to come to this, that maybe you were never quite enough. Machiavelli wouldn't try to comfort you out of that feeling. He'd ask one question: what are you doing with the half that belongs to you? Not the half that fortune controls. The other one. The one that's actually yours. The world isn't going to rearrange itself to make your path easier. That has never been how it works. What happens, the only thing that actually happens, is that you change, and then the world begins to respond to you differently. Not because it became more just, but because you became harder to dismiss. That's what he built in that farmhouse, with a wooden table and a candle and nothing left to lose. Not a system, not a set of rules. A way of being in the world that doesn't require anyone's permission, doesn't wait for favorable conditions, and doesn't collapse when the audience disappears. There's really only one question at the end of all this. What do you do now with what you already know? Knowing it and staying still is functionally the same as not knowing it. And moving, even slightly, even imperfectly, already makes you someone different than you were before you started reading.